Welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. This is a podcast for male survivors of sexual abuse and assault, whether as a child or as an adult. Know that you are not alone and the abuse was not your fault. My name is Mike Chapman. I'm a certified recovery life coach and also a survivor. Let's find hope and healing together. And welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. I'm your host, Mike Chapman, and we have a panel today on forgiveness. And if you want to join us live, you can learn more about how to do so on my website, polarlifeconsulting.com/live. And we do have a live audience here today. You can be as anonymous as you wish. If you would like us to say your name, go ahead and type that along with your question or comment in chat. If you do not state your name specifically on each post, we will keep you anonymous. And with me today, I've got several guests. Daniel Eichelberger, who's been on the podcast before, Kevin Bolger, who also has been on the podcast before. Both have been on panels as well. And Richard Windmann, who has an upcoming episode coming up in a few weeks, but he is also here on the podcast. I will give him a little bit more of time to introduce himself, but Kevin and Daniel as well, a little intro, and I will have links to their prior episodes, and keep an eye out for Richard's. It's coming up in a few weeks. So we'll start with Daniel, and again, the theme today is forgiveness. We'll be talking more about that in a moment, and this is part 2. Listen to last week's episode for part 1, where I go through James Janikin's podcast episodes on forgiveness, which I love and I mostly agree with. But you listen to my podcast on that, and you can see the points where I kind of disagree on some things. And we'll probably talk about that tonight, too. So let's start with Kevin. Kevin, quick intro.
Hello, I'm Kevin Bolger. I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and I have a podcast as well that Mike was our very first guest on. And
I was. Episode 10.
Episode 10, No Longer Ashamed. And this is the topic I'm very interested in, since myself and my host have gone through various stages of forgiveness, and I never expected to be able to forgive the perpetrator. For me, it was something that I never expected or really wanted, but then it kind of came up in an unusual way. I was getting married, and I wanted my whole family to be there, and one of my family members was my perpetrator, so that caused issues. And with God's help, I was able to find forgiveness and also reconciliation, and those don't always go together, but in my case they did. So yeah, this is a really interesting and exciting topic for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Now we'll go to Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Eichelberger. I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse from the time that I was young till I was about 14. And like many survivors, I blame myself. I didn't really understand it as abuse until I hit my late 30s, when my world came crashing down on me and I went through major depression. And it's from the recovery from that that I really started to understand my past and what happened to me. So now I am, along with other men, on the road to recovery and understanding and trying to help other men in their recovery journeys as well.
Excellent. And again, I'll have links to both Kevin's and Daniel's previous interviews with me, and I think they've both been on panels in the past. I'll link those too. Now, Richard, go ahead and explain a little bit more about who you are, since this is officially your first time on the podcast, though we did record an interview, and that will be posting in a few weeks. Keep an eye on that.
Yeah. So my name is Richard Windmann. I'm the president and co-founder of Survivors of Childhood Sex Abuse. We're an advocacy organization. Pretty large. We've got 37,000 members. I was abused myself from the ages of 7 to 17 years old by hundreds, if not over 1,000 men. I was involved in a Boy Scout Troop 137 in New Orleans. And then a policeman who is the head of the pedophile unit, he actually raped me. and a priest, a Jesuit priest.
Right. Yeah, there's been, if you watched any of the Netflix or Hulu, both had documentaries on Boy Scouts, and that was a big part of the investigation, a huge, basically sex trafficking ring involving Boy Scout leaders in New Orleans. Richard was one of the many victims in that, and that was a big chunk of both documentaries. So I'll have links to that as well on the show notes. And so we have a lot to forgive, and I know forgiveness is such a sensitive issue for survivors. And when I listen to other people's podcasts, they talk about this, or not wanting to forgive, or feeling like they can't forgive. And so I wanted to make a space where we can talk about that. And I know not everyone's from a faith background, and I can understand that. Though even Oprah Winfrey says forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past could have been any different. It's accepting the past for what it was and using this moment and this time to help yourself move forward. So during last week's episode, again, I'll have that link in the show notes as well. James Janikin's podcast talks about 10 things that are not true about forgiveness and 10 things that are true about forgiveness. And this is talking about people forgiving other people, not God forgiving us about things we've done wrong, or God forgiving somebody else for things they might have done to us. Totally separate concept. We're talking about one person forgiving another person for what that person has done to that first person. And let's just go through these one by one. The first thing is forgiveness is not easy, and it's not. It's very overwhelming. It's certainly not easy to even consider that, for so much happened to us. And for Richard and I and anyone else who might have been trafficked, there's multiple offenders, and there's the sellers and the buyers, plus if we're just simply abused, it's those abusers. And yeah, there's so much there, so much to forgive, and it's definitely not easy. Any comments on that, Kevin?
Yeah, forgiveness is not easy. I chose for a long time not to forgive. I was intentional about that, and I think it was because of the effect that the abuse had on me and what I had to go through to recover from that. I was very angry, and so I held on to that anger, and I didn't want to let go of that. And I felt like if I forgave, I would have to let go of that anger, and that was not necessarily true, but that's what I was afraid of.
Right, and that makes sense. Part of being able to forgive is processing pain that they mentioned, that we have to be ready to forgive, and that often means we have to get to the point where we can process pain to really understand the extent of the wound before we can get to the point that we even can forgive. So it's this whole process to get to the point, okay, now I'm at a point, yes, I can forgive him, but you have that processing time. And if you have anger and all those feelings, it's all related to the pain, processing the pain, so that you can reach the point and can forgive. For sure, that makes a lot of sense. Richard or Daniel, want to add to that?
So there was one of the perpetrators that I intentionally forgave. He was probably 21, and he was basically, it was his first time. He was forced to do it by one of the scout leaders, and so he didn't want to do it. He didn't like it. He was forced to do it. So I forgave him. The rest of them I haven't forgiven. And quite frankly, it doesn't bother me at all. Now, it did bother me earlier in my recovery when I was, like you say, angry. But I've since ditched the anger, but I didn't feel the need or the necessity to forgive, either for them or for me.
Right. And I've talked to a lot of survivors who are in that same camp. No desire to forgive, do not want to forgive, and that's okay. I know, I love that you did forgive someone who was forced to perpetrate. I know even a lot of children, when they are survivors of abuse, as children, they often will perpetrate on others, not really understanding what it means, that they were exposed to this thing, and it's like, oh, okay, and it's part of the grooming, it's normalized, and so they do it to other children because, hey, I was taught this thing, let me show you this cool thing, and it's perpetrated. They don't necessarily even know that it's wrong. So definitely in those situations, yes, you want to forgive because it really wasn't their fault, they're just acting out. And then when they're older but they're forced to perpetrate, and in a lot of trafficking scenarios that's very true, that people are forced to do other things. Or with ritualistic abuse, mind control, they are coerced into doing stuff that they might not otherwise do, and really bad stuff happens. And being able to forgive them. And when it's ourselves, if we are forced to perpetrate, or as children perpetrate on others, not really understanding what we're doing, forgiving ourselves too. I think that's a big part of it as well. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Richard. But a lot of people are not at this point and may never be at this point where they even understand the need or really feel the need for it. And if that's where you're at, that's fine. I do say, yeah, we're faith-based podcast, but not faith-forced. So if that's where you're at in your spiritual life and you feel there's no need, cool.
Well, I am very faithful. You know,
Right.
I've dumped religion, but you know, I have a very special relationship with God and Jesus. I think first off, I'm unlike a lot of survivors in that I never blamed myself. I knew it wasn't my fault. I knew I wasn't in control. It was the adults. I knew that I didn't do anything wrong. And also, I think it goes hand in hand with trust too. You know, trust is a very valuable and rare commodity in the victim and survivor community, and I think that trust may be a precursor or a prerequisite to actual forgiveness. Not that I'm an
Right.
expert on forgiveness. I just stated that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Daniel, anything to add?
Well, just that I think that, as a person of devout faith, I still struggle with conversation around forgiveness because a lot of times I think the church world has made it to be something that it isn't or should not be. And I think discussing the myths and the truths of it is beneficial because a lot of people think it is easy. And it's not. And for my part, I never viewed what happened to me as abuse until decades after it happened. And so part of my problem as a survivor in my approach to it, I never felt like I had anything to forgive until I started to understand that it was abuse. And when I started to understand that, it opened the floodgates of all kinds of emotions I had never felt before, including anger, disgust, revulsion. And so I spent years still thinking of those who abused me as my friends. And so now I have to deal with the fallout of everything and really sort through emotions and the whole idea of forgiveness. And so what I tell people when we're talking about this subject is I think I forgive those who abused me. I think I do. I feel like I do. I think. But, as we go through these truths and myths, things come up for me when we discuss them. And my general posture is one that I wish no harm on anyone, but it can be a struggle, and I acknowledge that and understand that now. I understand that now. I mean, not at one point in my life, I might have thought, you hear all the cliches, and I find myself now, and maybe the other men on here can identify with this, is I am very sensitive to cliches about forgiveness. When people start giving the typical run-of-the-mill Christian response to forgiveness, it's really ultimately just cliches. And I find something in me just rising up against those cliches because it's not it's not like memorizing a mantra or something. It's not a simple thing. It can be very, very difficult. And I find that so in my life. I find it so.
Right. Right. Forgive and forget. That's often quoted in Christian circles. It's Shakespeare. It's not biblical. And I discovered Shakespeare quotes it in 4 different plays, and I list those on last week's podcast. But God forgives and forgets. That's biblical. But it doesn't say we forgive and forget. Yes, forgive, but not forget. What other cliches were you thinking of other than the forgive and forget? Can you think of any other examples, Daniel?
Sometimes they don't even use the word forgiveness. They'll say things like move on.
Mm-hmm.
So that implies in it that you've come to peace with what happened to you,
Yeah.
which implies forgiveness.
Right.
So sometimes the word forgiveness isn't even a part of the cliche, but it's implied in the cliche. So move on. Yeah,
Right.
right.
Right. That you should be over this by now. Right. But I love the analysis James gives that certain wounds, yeah, if you get a little scrape on your hand, and I have a cat and I get little scrapes on my hand all the time from messing with my cat, and they heal and no biggie. But yeah, you get a big, huge wound like a broken leg or an amputee part of your body. It takes forever to heal, and it's a long process and might have huge scars that may take a long time to heal. Mentally, that's the same way, that it takes a long time for us to heal from severe abuse, and to be able to get on with it or get over it, it's not easy at all. And so many circles, it's a healing journey. It's not a destination. Okay, you're healed, you're done, get over it. No, it's a journey where we're constantly going through the pain, going through the process, healing. But I think, Daniel, it might have been you on a previous episode or event that the healing from scars, it never looks like the abuse never happened. There's still tremendous scars on us. So yeah, it's, you never heal to the point where it's not as if the abuse never happened, that there will always be scars in place.
That's the problem I have with people accept it as truth. I think it's cliche to say that, hey, you're not forgiving the act, you're forgiving the person. Well, that leaves me back at square one because I still have the abuse problem, right?
Right.
And I find it even more annoying and offensive when people try to force me to forgive.
Right.
You know, I hate to be close like that, or
Absolutely. And the list that we talked about last week, you have to be ready, and it cannot be forced. It has to be, you have to be willing to forgive, and you might not ever be ready to forgive, and that's okay. And God's certainly okay with that. He knows our heart. He knows what's going on. He knows our pain. And yeah, it can't be forced. It can't just be, okay, fine, I forgive him. Fine. It has to come from the heart, because God's saying, you liar, you're not even, you're just saying the words. He knows our heart. So yeah, it's like kids. It's like, forgive your brother for messing with you. Fine, I forgive you. And they don't. I mean, their kids don't get over it, but you know what I'm saying. But yeah, it cannot be forced. And people don't really understand that, especially in church circles, that yeah, it is forced. Yeah, I heard recently on a podcast where someone was raped recently, and they said, oh yeah, you need to forgive your rapist right away. And it's like, okay, no. Yes, maybe eventually someday, but no, not right away. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I hear all the time that in the Bible it says that you must forgive. I've never seen that, and I read the Bible occasionally, but certainly I've never ever heard of God demanding when I had to forgive.
Right. Yes, and
Yeah,
it's like, okay, God forgives you, so you should forgive others, but it's not like a commandment. But yeah, there's verses there, but yeah, it tends to get a little bit more forceful. Like, okay, you're not a Christian if you can't forgive other people. And it's like, okay, well,
and to your point, or just saying it all the time, why is it that Christians demand that I forgive and everybody really doesn't care if I forgive or
yeah,
not?
yeah, because they call it spiritual bypass. James mentions this as well, spiritual bypass, where they try to take whatever the trauma is or whatever the bad thing is and put a nice little happy face on it. Oh, you just forgive them, and then we don't have to deal with it, and then everything's okay, and then we can put on our fake smiles and be in church. And churches are really bad at putting on this nice, friendly, happy, smiley face mask, and
Right.
everything's all peachy keen and wonderful. And so we have to forgive everyone so we can move on. And yeah,
Well,
it
that's the thing.
oversimplifies that. Yes.
I moved on, so I guess what they're saying is I have to forgive my perpetrator for them, so they don't have to deal with it. I go through life all day long, and I never even mention my abuse to anybody. I have other conversations too.
Yeah, yeah, and I think a lot of time in Christian circles, the problem is not necessarily, bringing up the subject of forgiveness. It's just that they misunderstand what forgiveness is. And then, thankfully, the church that I've been in since I was a teenager now, when I started dealing with all this stuff, I have never been told, not once, by any of my pastoral counselors or anybody, my spiritual advisors, as I've wrestled through this stuff, not once, never once did they even bring up the word. They just allowed me to feel and to wrestle and supported me every step of the way through everything that I went through.
Excellent.
And I realized that a lot of people don't have that. A lot of the churches get it wrong. And I have some friends that come from like the Mennonite and the Amish backgrounds where there's a rush to force the victim to forgive the perpetrator. I mean, a rush. It's immediate once it's found out. You're expected to do that. If you don't, you're the person that's in
Right.
trouble. And they seek to restore the perpetrator into good fellowship with the church right away. It's like an instant thing. And they end up re-victimizing the victims, survivors. They're re-victimized through that process. That is
And
not
then
forgiveness. And a lot of churches get it wrong.
plus it empowers the perpetrator. It's like, oh, they forgive me and I can go on and I can keep doing the bad thing and I can do it again. And hey, we got to forgive me again. Okay. And it gives them carte blanche to do whatever the heck they want. It's like, no, 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 no. That's just so wrong. In my own case, I was my local church at the time was doing a CR, Celebrate Recovery group, and the leader knew my story, and it's like, so why aren't you over it now? It's like, dude, okay, you're supposed to be in charge of this recovery thing, and he didn't get it, but yeah, he still had a lot of his own stuff to work through that he hadn't yet. I don't know where he is now in his recovery, but it's like, yeah, why are you still dealing with all this? You should be over all this by now. And he didn't get it, and that was just so offensive. But then it was also God saying, yeah, you need to not be here, and you're going to get your healing all these other places that are going to be a better match for you and your healing journey. Yeah, time to leave. And it's like, yeah, he said that. It's like, okay, yeah, this is not going to be a good place for me. So yeah. So it was crystal clear, yeah, I'm not hanging around to this particular Celebrate Recovery. Others are great. I've been involved in Celebrate Recovery groups and other similar groups, and a lot of them are really good, very helpful. This
I,
one, not
I'm
so
a
much.
recovered alcoholic, and I can tell you that for about 10 years I drank really badly, and it was hard to quit.
Right,
And unlike forgiveness, my recovery was something that I had to give to God and surrender.
right, right.
Well, I
Yeah,
think a lot of the misconceptions about forgiveness are evident in the church.
Right.
Are forgiveness does not mean letting them off the hook, the
right,
perpetrator off the hook, and forgiveness is not for the perpetrator. And forgiveness does not mean you have to reconcile with them. It doesn't mean that you have to restore your relationship with them. That can be dangerous in many cases,
right.
and or you can be, setting yourself up for abuse, further abuse. So I think those are some of the misconceptions that it sounds like the churches are. Fortunately, my church was never that way, but yeah, it's certainly not forgive and forget. That never is the intention of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And we have someone in the audience agreeing with what Daniel said earlier. So yes, you're touching a nerve with our audience members as well. And very well said, Kevin. Daniel?
Yeah, Mike, I was just mulling this over, in the lead up to this panel. I was thinking, you mentioned at the outset of this conversation tonight that we're not talking about God's forgiveness. We're talking about, human forgiveness is what we're talking about. And there's a difference between us and God. And then there's in other ways where God wants us to be like him and mimic his nature. But people get it wrong when they think, well, Jesus forgave. Jesus did forgive. On the cross, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. But that forgiveness did not exonerate any of those people from culpability in his death and from, for those of us who believe in, eternity, and from eternal consequences for what they did. So God's forgiveness is not the same thing. And a lot of the scriptures that I read that are dealing with forgiveness are talking about forgiveness between brothers in the faith. And I'm sorry, if somebody is sexually abusing children, they're not a brother in the faith. They're not my brother. Nobody who abused me is my brother. So it's not the same thing. Yeah. Jesus did pray that. He said that. And he meant it. But that forgiveness that he extends has a corresponding requirement of the person he's extending it to. And this is one of those things in this discussion about what's true, myths and truths, is whether you can forgive whether or not the other person asks for forgiveness. And I suppose that is true to some extent. But your sense of forgiveness will be incomplete if the corresponding party has not acknowledged their error and refuses to. Three of those who abused me are dead now. I can't go back to them and have any kind of meaningful conversation with them, and work through the wrong they did to me and see if they're sorry. I can't do that. So that kind of relationship has been cut completely and severed forever. And I will never have that sense, in my heart, I can kind of come to a place of peace. Like I said, I think I forgive them, but I can never really know for sure because I cannot communicate with them if I wanted to. And I'm not suggesting people go communicate with their abusers. I'm just saying that there is a correspondence between the person who's been injured and the person who did the injuring. Even Jesus, in his reference to Peter saying, how many times shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? The idea there is that the brother is going to ask you for forgiveness, okay? But with a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with, we don't have people coming back and apologizing to us. We're dealing with the fact that something happened. And I can't ignore that. Right. God forgives and forgets sin in the sense that he doesn't hold it against us. But I have memory. And my memory was given to me by God to help me erect safe boundaries. And so I am not going to adopt an idea of forgiveness that forces me to blow through boundaries that are meant to protect me because my memory is telling me this person isn't safe. It has nothing to do with me forgiving them. It's just the fact of what has happened and what they've done. Right. And my memory serves me well. It's a God-given thing. And I'm not going to allow somebody else's misconstrued sense of forgiveness to force me into situations that I am not comfortable with because my memory serves a good purpose.
Right. And we talked about that before in the list that James came up with last week's episode, that it does not mean that there's no consequences. It does not mean that trust is restored. It does not mean that there's restoration or reconciliation. That, forgiveness is very separate from that. And it's a one-way thing. It doesn't necessarily even have to involve the other person. It's between you and God about that other person. But they could be a million miles away, or like the perpetrators. I don't know who all my perpetrators were. I was sedated. I know it was a lot. I don't know their names, maybe one or two faces, but it's still a process. I'm going, I forgive them. Well, it's a process. I'm getting there. But yeah. And then going back to your point earlier, Daniel, Jesus, when he overturned the tables of the money changers in front of the temple.
Exactly.
He didn't say, you guys are sinning, I forgive you, and walked away. No. He overturned those tables. It's like, no. And he called them out. Shamed them. It's like, oh, well, he wasn't a good example because if he was Jesus, he would have forgiven him right away, right? But he is Jesus, and no, he didn't. So that's a godly example that, it yeah, it's to a point, but if it's really bad, yeah, you call them out. And you don't forgive them right away. Yeah, so there's all these other examples.
Yeah, and to go back to Dan's point is I study pedophiles, and two of them are actually my offenders, and I do that to get a better understanding of them. And not one of them, not one, to Dan's point, has ever asked for forgiveness. Not one,
Right.
not ever.
Well, likewise.
And I think Jesus was just really offended because the money changers were on the grounds of the temple. Huh?
Right. Yes, exactly. Exactly. That you had to have to be able to give your tithe. It had to be the local currency and not your foreign currency. People would come from other countries to come and pay their respects or alms or whatever it was the requirement then. But the custom is, oh, no, you have to do the local currency. So they're there. They will change to whatever the local currency is and make a hefty profit. And that, yeah, no, you don't do that. That's not right.
Well, even more specifically, Jesus is the protector of children. He says, if any man makes one of these little ones to stumble, it's better for him that a millstone be tied around his neck and that he be drowned in the depths of the sea. Now, those are the words of the Savior. You don't see a lot of that mirrored.
Right. And
Right.
the millstones back then, they're not little tiny things. It was like for people had windmill or whatever, grinding wheat into flour. It was this huge, monstrous, multi-ton stone that they used, and then there was like one wheel on top, and it would just grind it to make flour. And yeah, so they're huge. So a millstone, yeah, it's like cement galoshes, even worse than cement galoshes. No, you're going down. So, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. I love that. Yeah, let's see. Any other things on here? It does not mean forgetting what happened. I think we talked about that. Yeah, forgive and forget. That's Shakespeare. Forgiveness does not mean what happened was acceptable. Absolutely, and we've talked about that. Forgiveness does not mean that the hurt is completely gone. And there's levels of pain, and that's part of our healing journey, that forgiveness can help us relieve some of that, but it doesn't mean it's all gone. It doesn't mean that the scars are no longer there. Those scars are there. We can reprocess some of that through years and years of therapy, but yeah, my pain is still there. I still get PTSD. I still get triggers, some severely, and those aren't going to go away. Those are still there. So yeah, the hurt is not completely gone, even as I forgive perpetrators. It's like, well, why are you still dealing with this? Okay, because I'm still having flashbacks. I still have triggers. I still have all this stuff going on with me and my brain because of all these severe traumas. Absolutely. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the big surprises for Lori and me when we've been doing our podcast is we thought we were past a lot of stuff, and so we could talk about it and share
Surprise!
our experience. When we started having guests on and so forth, we realized, oh my gosh, we're getting triggered by stories, we're getting triggered by things, and stuff came up, and we would just be blindsided. And yeah, it does not mean you're over it. It does not mean it's just done. Because, yes, I've forgiven my perpetrator and I've reconciled with him, but there are still times that it's not easy. There's still anger there. There's still PTSD there. There's still things that trigger me. I recognize them, so I'm aware of them. And I think that's the process, as you become more aware.
Yeah.
I think survivors are more self-aware than most people,
Yeah,
because
that's true.
we have to be, because we go through this. At least if you've gotten into therapy, gotten healing, you become so self-aware. So I recognize stuff better, but that doesn't mean things don't come up. And I think that's what really surprised Lori and me is, we're doing this podcast and we're interviewing someone, and I check out and disassociate while we're doing it, and then she checks in on me or something happens, and we're just like, wow, what happened? And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I've been doing advocacy work for 13 years, and when I started the organization, for a good couple of years, vicarious trauma was a big deal.
Yeah, it's hard. Vicarious trauma is hard because I think a lot of survivors have a lot of empathy. And yeah, it can be really tough sometimes because you're feeling what they've gone through and what they're going through still, and it hurts. It
Mhm.
really
Right.
hurts sometimes.
Right. Right. Yeah. I like that comment about empathy. Yeah. We should do a podcast on that. But yeah, it's very true. I've heard it from a lot of people. It's like you feel their pain, and I feel people's pain. So yeah, when I do psychotherapy type of things with husband material and getting guys to get rid of anger and finding ways and trying not to empathize too much, because then it's like I'm taking all that. It's like they're getting rid of all the gunk. It's like I need to have like this little wall. They've got all their gunk. They're getting their gunk out. I'm helping them get their gunk out. But I don't need to get their gunk on me. And that's hard for sure. But yeah, that hurt is not completely gone. Daniel?
And the empathetic approach to survivors of deep emotional woundings is not to repeat the word forgiveness over and over. Most of the time, I don't think survivors really have trouble with forgiving. They have trouble processing what happened. And so, constantly harping on forgiveness is denying them the right and the necessary step of processing the enormous wrong that was done to them. It's denying the wrong that has been done to them. And if let's just look at it this way, Mike and Richard and Kevin, if you were in the
Right.
kitchen and you were peeling an onion, and I walk in and you have tears, you're sniffling, I'm like, why are you reacting like that? Why are you reacting like that? This shouldn't be bothering you. And with every layer, you know how it is with onions. The deeper you go in the onion, the more powerful this is. That is grief. That is grief in a nutshell. It's like peeling back the layers of that onion. And people standing who just walk in the kitchen, by the way, they didn't spend the last 30, 40 years with you. And they're just walking into the kitchen and they're like, why are you reacting this way? Why are you doing this? Why are you even peeling the onion? You know, it's no. The empathetic approach is, let me help you with that. You know, or
Huh.
let me assist you. There's ways to mitigate how you're feeling about this, but not just telling you to throw the onion away. Not just telling you, just coming in and judging you for your response. Your response is legitimate. The advice that you get sometimes is not.
Not so much.
I think Michael
Yeah.
could do like a 3-hour show on annoying things that normies say.
And I love the term. I'm hearing that more and more, normies,
Yeah.
while I do this. So, yeah, it's like, what do you call it? It's like landline versus cell phone. It was just the phone for the longest time. Then it became the landline. Okay, so we got normies, meaning, yeah, for us, those haven't had the experience of having the abuse or this
Addic-
type of trauma. Yeah, and that's,
Yeah.
I think it comes from that,
normies.
yeah, the addiction or alcohol recovery.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, you hear it a lot.
yeah. Yeah, I love that. We've got some time left. We'll go through a couple more of these. Does not require repentance or an apology. So even though we don't hear from them, we can still forgive them. But going back to the one before, doesn't mean the hurt's gone, doesn't mean the pain is gone. And the next one, it does not mean that there are no consequences. They still have consequences. And then the ones we talked about earlier, does not mean trust is restored, does not mean restoration or reconciliation. And next one, it's not a one-time event. Yeah, that's 70 times 7. That sometimes stuff that happened is repressed and that stuff comes up. Oh, it's more stuff. I've got to process, go through the pain and so forth, and then release it, including forgiving that person. Like my father, who is my main perpetrator, more stuff comes up. And it's like, okay, I can forgive him. or I get severely triggered because of what happened. It's like, okay, yeah, this is all stuff my father did. Okay. And it's kind of cyclical. It's like you go back and visit, same thing with wounds and so forth. And it's okay. It's not a one and done thing. It can take time to do it. And plus they might reoffend or more stuff comes up that you forgot about. Yeah. So it's definitely a process. Anyone want to say anything about any of that?
Yeah, it sounded like for a second that your forgiveness was temporary. I don't mean to say it that way, but
Right.
you clarified that it's a cycle, it's a journey.
Right. Exactly. It's like the layers of an onion that, yeah, you're just going deeper and deeper, but there's still more layers. Yeah.
I
It's
think
not
for
like, yeah, the forgiveness didn't take, but there's still, yeah, there's levels for sure. Kevin?
I think for a lot of survivors that have repressed memory, that's very important because things come up as explore what you
Yeah.
went through, as you're exploring your experiences, and I think a lot of survivors are very good at repressing memories. I know I am, and Lori was as well. And as things come up, like you said, Mike, we have to decide if we're going to forgive again,
Right.
and go through that process all over again. For me, it was different people. All of a sudden, I realized there were others I had to forgive,
Yeah.
and then you decide, I got to go through this, and I got to do this. And I think one of the things that's not on this list is forgiveness is not a necessity or is not required. I think first we talked about, for Christians, it's almost like we're required to forgive. And I know in the Lord's Prayer, forgive me my sins as I forgive those who sinned against me. So,
Right.
Jesus is telling us he wants us to forgive. Doesn't mean it's always required. I believe that, we have that choice and we have to make that choice. It's not like someone's telling us to do it. We have to make that choice.
Right.
Yeah, it's like I said earlier, it's I don't know what's weird about me, but I don't feel compelled. I don't feel anything about forgiveness. I don't have the need to forgive. I don't, and I'm good with that. I'm spiritually, and my soul is whole. I just it's a non-issue in my life for some strange reason.
Right. Right. And I get that for sure. And you're not the first survivor I've met who feels that way. And that's cool. Absolutely. One other thing, we're running out of time a little bit. I did want to go to the one thing that James said that I agree in theory what he said, but then his description, it's like, no, 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 no. And that was forgiveness is costly. And we must give up our feelings and desires for justice and surrender them to God and trust his justice. And he goes on about that.
I don't forgive him for saying that. That was a joke.
I can forgive James. He's my friend, and I'll forgive him for saying that. But he hasn't listened to my podcast. He said he knows it's out there. It's like, yeah, I'll get to it later on this week. And it's like, okay, it'll be interesting to see what he says. It's like, yeah, and I get what he's saying, but yeah, there's just so much there that as a survivor, yeah, if someone does a class action suit against the United Methodist Church, yeah, I'm going to be first in line to testify for sure. And it's like, oh, no, you forgive. And then, no, you don't do that. It's like, no. And then you should not tell your story. He mentioned that too. It's like, what? No, you tell your story so you can process it and help others to learn who've experienced similar traumas. Not that, oh, you're done, you've forgiven them, now don't talk about it. I think it goes back to what Daniel was saying. It's like, no, the church, they want the happy face. And if you talk about it, we have to take off the happy face. And that messes with their, oh, happy, perfect church world, everything's perfect, hunky-dory. No, bad stuff happens, and it's okay. And it's okay to talk about it. Oh, no, we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's gossip. That's, no. Talk about it. Absolutely. Daniel.
Oh, the Catholic Church hates it when you talk about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Mike, and disagree with that truth that he put out on the list more. I do agree with the part of it that it's costly. It costs you everything, but that doesn't mean that
Mm-hmm.
you let the perpetrator go
Right.
on to abuse other people. To me, forgiveness is a posture of heart. It's something I have to revisit when things come up, like Kevin was saying, when memories come back. It's a posture of heart that I need to maintain.
Yes.
And I believe that forgiveness takes the demand for retribution out of your heart, but not the consequences for the perpetrator. Like, God's going to deal with the perpetrator's eternity, okay? But there might be some law
Yes.
enforcement that needs to deal with the perpetrator's current status here, because if you smooth things
Right.
over for the perp, they can go on to offend, and then I've compounded the wrong done to me, right? I've compounded the wrong. If I don't allow, the law protects children for a
Right.
reason. And I need to recognize that. The church does not have authority, in the United States at least, to, or should not. They've acted like it. Different churches have acted like they have the authority, but the church does not have the authority to determine what's best in those situations. They make the mistake almost 100% of the time. And so you have to have the civil government with a divested interest in religious authority to actually hold these people accountable so they don't re-offend. That's good for the perpetrator, and that's good for other children out there if they face
Right.
consequences.
Absolutely.
And I believe you can forgive the person and still wish that person behind bars. 100%.
Right. Though it doesn't mean, okay, you're going out with a lead pipe in one hand and your sawed-off shotgun in the other and going after these guys. Much that might be fun, but yeah, no. Through the legal system, legal justice system, we're trying to revenge or, all of that. No. Leave that to the professionals. Don't go after them yourself. Don't try to ruin their lives or whatever. But yes, definitely pursue them within the justice system, even though it sucks. There's so out of hundreds of cases, thousands of cases that are even just presented. Very, very small percent even get tried, and then even lower will see any jail time. So it's just, and it doesn't mean they didn't do it. It just means the evidence to clear that beyond a reasonable doubt has to be so clear that perpetrators get away with it. But also for that reason, anytime we can participate within the legal system to help stop perpetrators, oh my Lord, please, if you are at all able to make a difference, please participate in the process. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kevin.
So I kind of get the caustic part too, but I think for me, and I think talking about the benefits of forgiveness are really important. For me, what it cost me was the burden I held as far as I was holding on to this bitterness in my life. I was
Right.
holding on to this, and it felt like it empowered me. It felt like that's where I was getting my power from, was holding on to this control over someone else because I had so much anger and so much, I was setting up so many boundaries around them and excluding them from my life and, doing these things that felt empowering. But the forgiveness released me from my grip on that. And
Right.
that's where forgiveness brings freedom. Forgiveness brings this release. It felt like a load of bricks off my back because I didn't have to hold on to that
Right.
anymore.
Exactly.
And so,
Right. And it's a lot of rent in your brain, a lot of square footage in your brain that you don't necessarily need to give to the perpetrator. You can free yourself of that burden for sure.
and because of that release, I could work on myself and work on my own healing rather
Yeah.
than, focusing on what had happened and how, that was such a unrighteous thing. I
Right.
could focus on my healing, and it allowed me to focus on my healing. And that's where the benefit of forgiveness isn't for the perp, isn't for the person you're forgiving, it's for yourself.
Right.
And that's where I found freedom. And I think that's what God was trying to teach me and trying to get me to that point, because it took me a while. I mean, I did a lot of praying. I did a lot of praying for help to forgive. And it wasn't until I recognized that I had forgiven, and it wasn't a conscious thing in my head. It was just that I started praying for his health and healing. And then I realized that's when I had come to a place of forgiveness. And so it does cost, but I think the cost is that thing we're hanging on to, that sense of righteousness that we have been, that we need to hang on to this thing that happened to us. But that's the cost, is letting go
Yeah.
of that. But when you let go of that, there's the freedom, at least for me. And then, you know, I can move on and start to heal rather than hang on to this burden.
Absolutely. And can I use those as your final thoughts? Because those are beautiful final
Oh,
thoughts. Any final thoughts, Daniel?
I think it's true. And maybe I've kind of come out as being a little strong. And that's just because my nature, it just tends to be defending people, allow them the time to process. It's not easy. I think if
Yeah.
forgiveness is
No.
important, I think I forgive my abusers. That's my posture of heart. I
Right.
will continue to do that. But I also believe that we have a vested interest in protecting others. And so forgiveness doesn't mean all the things we said it doesn't mean. And I appreciate that
Mhm.
clarity. I wish more people had it. And I think a lot of people just actually do forgive, but maybe they think they
Right.
don't because Christians get it so wrong of what it means.
Right. Oh, I still feel pain. So wait, maybe I haven't forgiven him. No. Yeah, harm was caused and pain is still there, and that's okay. Absolutely. Richard, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I regret that the victims and survivors even have to go through this process.
Mhm.
I think it was a great talk that we had today. I appreciate all of you, you
Yeah.
specifically, Michael, for inviting me, and I got to meet two new friends. But right now it's my wife's birthday, and no offense, but she smells a lot better than you guys. Okay.
Well, I put on my virtual deodorant today,
Yeah.
so it wasn't me. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you
Nice
for this
to meet you,
discussion.
Richard.
What's that, Kevin?
I said, nice to meet you, Richard.
You
Yes.
too.
And that wraps it up. Forgiveness is definitely a process. It does bring freedom, but there's so many myths and so forth. More details, last week's episode, and we'll see you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. If you would like to learn more about my coaching with Polar Live Consulting, where I provide one-on-one coaching and group coaching, both with a focus on healing for male survivors, reach out to me at polarliveconsulting.com. That is Polar spelled Polar. I would love to hear from you. I want to hear your story. If you would like your story featured on this podcast, contact me via my website. If you like this podcast, please rate and review, because that's how other people can find me, and I really want to spread this message of healing and hope to others. And remember, you are not alone. Healing is possible, and the abuse was not your fault. Let me repeat that. The abuse was not your fault. See you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast.